Okay, go ahead and open up to Hebrews chapter 11. And we're in the closing verses of Hebrews chapter 11. And of course, as we had mentioned before, the writer focuses on a variety of works that were done by God's people of old by faith. Last week, we talked about the faith of David, who subdued kingdoms, and we also included Joshua in that, but then also Joshua and Caleb as they had obtained promises. We talked about Daniel, who stopped the mouths of lions, and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who quenched the violence of fire. And so this week we continue to note the works that were done by faith by the people of God. And so the next one we come to as we look in the text is escaped the edge of the sword. Now, there's no way for us to know how many of God's people have escaped the edge of the sword. And keep in mind, the Hebrew writer is talking about people of old. There's been people since the Hebrew writer has written this who've also escaped the edge of the sword. But there are some prominent ones that come to mind who were in the Old Testament. And the first of those is Moses. You remember that Moses, seeing an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, that he rose up and he defended his kindred, and in the process he ended up killing the Egyptian. And so when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. And that, of course, was when Moses fled from Egypt. Now, was he afraid? I suspect that he was. Anytime that somebody wants to do you harm, somebody wants to kill you, there's fear. But if we look at Moses naming his children, there's actually a bigger picture to see. In Exodus chapter 18, at verse 3 and 4, we read about the names of Moses' children. And it's interesting. It says here in verse 3 beginning, the name of one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. And the name of the other was Eliezer, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. In naming his son, he actually commemorated his escape from Egypt. And he did escape the edge of the sword, and in fact, that's how he words it. The God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Now understand, his son's name does not refer to the Exodus, it refers to the first time he left. When he had to run from Pharaoh, run away so that he would not be killed, he was delivered from the sword of Pharaoh in that. Another servant of God who escaped the edge of the sword was David. Certainly he faced a lot of enemies through his time, and the Lord gave him safety and protection when he was in battle, but the Lord also preserved David's life when he was pursued by King Saul. And I guess if we're being technical, and rather than escape the edge of the sword, it would be escape the edge of the spear in that case, because it seems that Saul's weapon of choice is a spear. He's always got a spear in his hand, as we're reading about him. But nonetheless, David escaped the edge of the weapon in the hand of King Saul. Now we might wonder, well, why was Saul interested in killing David in the first place? Because they're both Israelites, and they're both fighting for God's people. And we've mentioned it before about David and how successful he was. In fact, in 1 Samuel chapter 18, you will see 3 times in that text, it talks about how David behaved himself wisely, and therefore God had blessed him. And Saul, of course, became jealous. And so God was with him. He spent the larger portion of his time when serving Saul in running, on the hiding from Saul, and God continually preserved David through all of that. He escaped the edge of the sword. Let me give you a third example of one who escaped the edge of the sword, and that's Elijah. And Elijah's circumstances are a little bit different than Moses and David's. Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 18, we've got that great victory. Remember, he was against the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, and God gave him this great victory, and in fact, he killed the prophets of Baal, and Israel seems to be back on board. It's only momentary, but they seem to be back on board with serving God. And immediately we get into chapter 19, and his life is threatened by Jezebel. The first two verses in chapter 19 read this way. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all of the prophets with the sword. That's the prophets of Baal. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So let the gods do to me, and more so, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. You have 24 hours, and I'm going to kill you." And so Elijah runs. And unfortunately, his escape is a low point in his faith. Nonetheless, he still escaped the edge of the sword, but his escape was a low point in his faith. He ran southward, and he just kept on running. He ran and ran, and eventually he found himself somewhere in the wilderness near Beersheba, 200 kilometers away. He did not stop. He just kept going. It would take multiple days for him to make this kind of trip. But he was getting as far away as he could from this threat. And so there he is, and he's scared, and he's exhausted, he's wearied, and Elijah finally falls asleep. Understand, he's in a very dark place in his faith at this point. Just the circumstances of life were really heavy upon him. And so God sent an angel to Elijah. And the angel tended to him. The angel provided food and provided drink. In fact, the angel came back again, was there more than once to tend to the needs of Elijah. And if the Lord hadn't done so, my guess is that the prophet would have just withered away and died there in the wilderness. He was not in a position or a mindset to really be tending to his own needs. But the second time that the angel came to Elijah, 1 Kings 19 verse 7, it reads this way. The angel said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." And the reading of that, we might think, well, what journey? He's already completed the journey from Mount Carmel to Beersheba, these 200 kilometers that he went. That journey's complete. How could it be too great for him? Well, the prophet's actually going to keep going. He's going to keep fleeing. By the end of it, he's going to go another 425 kilometers south. He's going to end up down near Mount Horeb, verse 8 would tell us. But when he gets there, all he's doing is hiding. He finds a cave and he hides. But let me suggest to you that's not the journey that the angel is talking about. Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. The word used here for journey, it's the Hebrew word derek. And it means more than just a trip from A to B. That's not the kind of journey this is about. It's about one's course of life. It's about the circumstances that we face in life. And the angel says to Elijah, life is too difficult for you. And Elijah actually would agree with that. He's ready to quit. But the angels say, no. Understand, God is providing for you. The journey's too great for you to do it alone. You ever hear folks use the phrase, God will not give you more than you can handle? I've used that phrase. Some of you been here for a bit, you heard me preach a sermon on that about 3 years ago, I believe. And I've not used the phrase since preaching that sermon. God will not give you more than you can handle. The statement sounds good. It sounds biblical. But do you know that there's not a single Bible verse that indicates that to be so? Not one. Things sometimes come our way that go beyond our ability to handle. And that's where Elijah was in this case. He escaped the edge of the sword, but he was not in a good disposition. And he needed God. Understand that when he started running southward, he actually went AWOL. That's not where God wanted him. Not only 200 kilometers, but another 625 kilometers away from from where God wanted him to be. But the fact is, sometimes things in our lives are beyond our ability to handle on our own. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 8, the Apostle Paul says this. This is from the English Standard Version. We were so utterly burdened beyond our strength. Or from the NIV, the same verse, we were under great pressure far beyond our ability to endure. Well, what'd you do, Paul? If it was beyond your ability to endure, verse 9, he understood from these things that were beyond his ability to endure that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God. Sometimes we're in circumstances where all we can do is seek God's help because we can't do it by ourselves. That's where Elijah was. Yes, he escaped, but he still needed God. And had he trusted in God, the escape actually wouldn't have been needed. God will allow us to be in situations which are beyond our ability. Remember that statement? God will not allow you to go allow what's beyond your ability. God will allow it. Because he wants us to learn to trust in him. Remember Job? All the things that Job went through? Tell me that Job was able to endure what he went through. Read the book of Job and tell me that. Right? We look at Job and we see that God put limits on what Satan was able to do. And thank you, Lord, for doing that kind of thing. But what happened to Job was still beyond Job. How many times does he say in the text that he just wants to die? That he hates life? That he wishes he was never born? Job needed to learn to have complete dependence upon God. The Apostle Paul, remember in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, he has that thorn in the flesh. He doesn't tell us what it is, no point speculating on what it is, but he asked God to get rid of it. 3 times he asked God to get rid of it. Here's God's answer. My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Paul, keep your weakness, because that's how we'll show my strength. And so Elijah, the journey, the course of life is too great for you. That was the message of the angel. Trust in God. And we need to do so as well. And as I said, he escaped the edge of the sword, but his running away only gave a momentary escape. He had to go back. He had to go back. Elijah had to go back, return to Syria, and when he was faithful and when he was doing the things that God was calling him to do, the threat was gone. He was called to go back. He was to rebuke the house of Ahab for their wickedness. He was to appoint a new king over Israel who would be Jehu. He was to mentor a new prophet who would be Elisha. And when he came back and he committed himself to doing what God wanted him to do, the threat dissolved. It was gone. And so he escaped the edge of the sword. He took the difficult route. Could have been easier for him. But again, a challenge of his faith caused him to go where he did and do what he did. All right, the next thing back in Hebrews chapter 11 we come across, after it speaks about those who escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong. Again, it's hard to tell exactly who the writer has in mind with a statement such as this. Certainly several that would fit the bill. The Apostle Paul We know it's not him because he comes along after all these other individuals. He may have actually been the one who was writing this down. But he experienced that. The text that we just talked about in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, praying about that thorn in the flesh, my grace is sufficient for you, the Lord said, my strength is made perfect in weakness. Listen to Paul's conclusion after that. I will boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Out of weakness, we're made strong. When I am weak, then I am strong, because God is in control. And so this out of weakness, they were made strong. Again, it suits many of the circumstances of Israel in the Old Testament. They were a nation of slaves. There they were, brought down to Egypt, and they were free when they were brought in. But after a Pharaoh arises who doesn't know Joseph, they were turned into a nation of slaves and heavily persecuted. And yet they exited Egypt free and prosperous. Whenever they would go into battle, they were outnumbered. I don't know of a single situation in the battles of Israel recorded in the Old Testament where they went in with more people than the opponent. And they're always outnumbered in battle. And sometimes it's immense outnumbering. Remember the case of Gideon. Gideon and his 300 men up against a Midianite army that is just massive. And they're victorious. Out of weakness, we're made strong. It's the case with David. David is a teenager. He's not a young child, as some people portray him to be when he comes up against Goliath. He's a teenager. He's not a warrior. He's not a soldier. But out of the state of weakness, or the appearance of weakness, that which was stronger than he came tumbling down. Because God made David strong because of his faith. The same was the case with Jonathan and his armor bearer. Remember, Jonathan says to his armor bearer, God can save by many or by few. Let's go. And so off they go, and they defeat a garrison of the Philistines, just the two of them. The statement also fits and might actually be about the circumstances of Samson. He was a strong man, had several victories against the Philistines in his day. However, when they learned the secret of his strength, you'll recall that they tied him up and they cut his hair, and his strength was gone. His strength was tied to his vow, the Nazirite vow. And so when his hair was cut, the vow was broken, the strength was gone. They're able to then take him away as a prisoner and keep him bound, pluck out his eyes, all those awful things that they did to him. But you remember at the end of Samson's life, there he is, and he's able to reach out and touch the pillars. He can't see them, but he asked the young lad who was leading him to take me close to the pillar. And then he prayed. He prayed, he said, O Lord God, remember me, I pray, strengthen me, I pray, just this once, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines. And at that point, out of weakness, he was made strong. And he was able to bring down that whole temple and destroy the Philistines. Is it about Samson? It certainly might be. It's about several, I would believe, who out of weakness were made strong. The next statement, again, it's a rather generic statement, became valiant in battle. Take your pick. This fits a lot of people from the Old Testament. But let me give you just a few examples to consider, and some of these we've talked about, but and some of them are earlier in the chapter itself. But think about Abraham. He's not one that we typically think of as being a warrior of sorts. But you remember when his nephew Lot was taken into custody? There was a battle between the kings in the down in that area. And 5 kings came up and battled against the kings in the area of Sodom and Gomorrah and so forth. And Lot was sort of caught up in the whole deal. He got carted away, he and his family and all that he owned. And so Abraham and his servants rose up and went against the 5 kings that were victorious. And they won. Released Lot, and not only Lot, but others as well. And so he became valiant in battle, despite the fact that he was most certainly not a warrior, and at that point was a very aged man as well. Moses, when he led the Israelites through the wilderness wanderings, they had enemies come up against them on a fairly regular basis. And every time he was valiant in battle and led them to victory. Joshua, as they enter the land and fight against the inhabitants of the land, victorious every time we read about, except once. That was at Ai, and that was because of sin that took place at Jericho. But pick your judge, go through the whole book of the Judges. All of them had God on their side and were valiant in battle. The list goes on and on of people that would fit this. But time and again we see that God's people, when they enter battle, they can do so with confidence. Not in their own might, but in God's might. And when they do so, they're victorious. In fact, you've heard me say this in classes at times. I don't know that we can find a single case where an Israelite died in battle unless Israel was not doing God's will. They died at Ai. What was it, 32 of them, 34 of them, something like that? We actually have the number given, and it's a small number. But when they went up against Jericho, they all came back. They go up against Ai because of the sin at Jericho, not all of them came back. But after that, you look at the battles that they're involved in, and they all come back. We don't have numbers of Israelite casualties given to us. Which makes sense. If God is on your side, you're going to be victorious. And so they were valiant in battle because God was with them. The last one we'll look at today is they turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Among the promises that were made to Israel as they were making their way to the land of Canaan was this. Leviticus chapter 26, verse 7 and 8. You will chase your enemies, and they shall fall by the sword before you. 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. Your enemies shall fall by the sword before you. What a promise. Why is it that Gideon is able to go with 300 men against an innumerable number on the other side? Because of things like this. God tells his people, when you're serving me, you have victory. The numbers don't matter. You can be in the minority and you will have victory. Because when God's on your side, you're the majority. And so this great promise, Joshua repeated the same. Joshua 24 and verse 10, he says, 1 man of you shall chase 1,000, for the Lord your God is he who fights for you, as he promised. God will fight for you. The number, again, Gideon's army. We don't know how many they battled against. Judges 7 verse 12 says, the Midianites and the Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number as the sand of the seashore in multitude. Gideon walks away with victory. Despite exceptionally offset numbers, God's promise always held true. However, they were warned that the opposite could happen as well. Deuteronomy chapter 32 at verse 30. The question is asked, how could one chase 1,000 and 2 put 10,000 to flight unless their rock had sold them and the Lord had surrendered them? This is in the midst of the warnings that Moses gives at the end of Deuteronomy. If you do not continue in faith, this and this and this and this will happen. And this was one of the things. And so what was a wonderful promise to the people, if they will walk by faith, would also be an awful curse to them if they forsook faith. And so the Hebrew writer, he speaks about those who turn to flight the armies of the aliens. And again, pick your person or pick your generation that would fit. But understand it had to be done by faith. They had to be walking in God's way. And when they didn't walk in God's way, that promise did not work. It actually got reversed on them. God expects his people to serve him faithfully. All right, well, the theme of these ones that we've looked at today is victory. Victory for God's people in battle. All of the statements deal with victory in battle. Escape the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. And if we'll have faith in God and we walk faithfully before him, then we're assured victory. That's just always been the case with God. His people walk his way, he will give them victory. Listen to a few of the people of God say this kind of thing. Reveal it so that people understand. Moses to the people. Remember that they've come out of Egypt and they're there at the Red Sea. And the Egyptian army is behind them and the sea is in front of them. What are we going to do? Here's what he says. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. But have faith. And then the Red Sea opens up and they pass through. David, when he's speaking to Goliath, this is what he told Goliath. The battle is the Lord's. See, you and me, we're not the ones who are in battle here. It's not David versus Goliath. It's Goliath versus God. God's going to win. The battle is the Lord's. 1 Samuel 17, verse 47. Jonathan, when he was talking to his armor bearer, listen to what he said. Nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few. So it's not about us. It's about the Lord. Jonathan understood we can go in there with a garrison of our own and we'll have victory. Or we can go in there with just the two of us and we'll have victory. Because nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few. In the days of King Jehoshaphat, the prophet Jahaziel came and spoke to him. Here's what he told King Jehoshaphat. The battle is not yours, but God's. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. No need to fear. No need to be in dread. The battle is not yours, but God's. Friends, we need to keep that in mind. We're in the battle, and we need to continue, but it's not our battle. It's God's battle. And if you and I will just simply serve him faithfully, he gives victory. He has a 100% record of doing that. When his people serve him faithfully, he gives them victory. And so, may we walk faithfully. If we can help you in so doing today, we want to do so. If we need to be opening up our Bibles and studying on some topics to help us in our walk of faith or to deal with questions we have, then let's do that kind of thing. However we can build each other up in faith. There's no reason for any to end up in hell. God has made it possible for us to end up in heaven. He's given us a Savior, Jesus Christ. He's given the forgiveness of sins by his shed blood. He's given us his word in order to direct us and lead us. Not a list of do's and don'ts. That's not the nature of God's word. God's word is what good life is like. And in fact, the Old Testament, that's what Moses said to them after giving them the law. God gave them what is good and wanted them to do what was good, to choose life and not choose death. The same before us with the New Testament. God gives us, here's the good life. Here's the way to live. Here's the profitable and beneficial and good way for us to live in this world. So let's choose to do so. And God will honor that choice and bless that choice, and he will have a place for you and I in heaven in the hereafter. So let's encourage one another in that, and if we can help you in some way in the pursuit of heaven, let us know as we stand together and sing.